Time for a spiritual awakening. Time for a spiritual awakening.
Well, today we're going to be talking about the power of God and Spirit in our lives and our total dependency really on God's sustaining grace in our lives as well. Nothing really occurs or is sustained without the power of God. Too often we forget this and we think in terms of separation. We're separate from our God, the power source, of course, in our lives, and we think we're separate from our brothers and sisters as well. The two seem to go hand in hand. The more unfit I am spiritually, the more unfit I am socially, and the less I know the power of God in my life. These are axioms that are always true. They're changeless. They are forever part of the fabric of the law of cause and effect, the law of good, the law of creation, the law of attraction. All of these are consistent with loving thy neighbor and loving God and recognizing our dependence on both for our own salvation. Well, we'll be reading today from Living in the Light. Here's a copy of my book, Living in the Light. It's a daily devotional. And I want to read on page 211, week 35. It says, He is strong when we are weak. We need to understand our constant need for God. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is to think we are self-sufficient. We need God's love, God's wisdom, God's instruction, and fellowship every day. When we're at our weakest, our most low and broken, that is when the Lord's grace and power can shine through our lives in the brightest. We should never be embarrassed to need God. Rather, we should be embarrassed when we think we do not need God. We need to have total dependence on the Lord. Being too proud to admit our need for God in our lives is really to be ashamed of Him. Denying the need for His power in our lives works only to our peril. And a brief affirmation. Lord, today I recognize my deep need for you in every area of my life. Well, many years ago, I was teaching a class for the city of Nashville. It was an organization called Peace, and we would deal with anger management issues, typically men who, on domestic abuse issues, had been directed to the classes. And I had a conversation with one of the men, clients in the class, who said that he couldn't pray to God because of his own sinfulness and how many mistakes he'd made in his life. And he felt that he was unworthy of calling on God. Well, this is a typical example, I think, of how many of us feel that we need to be in a perfect position to talk and rely on God, rather than to understand that God's function really comes to the fore when we are at our weakest, as it says here. Uh, let's see. Um, yes. Um, we should never be embarrassed to need God. Rather, we should be embarrassed to think we don't need God. So when we're at our weakest, our lowest, our most broken, that's when the Lord's grace and power can shine through our lives the brightest. So I wanted to make this point clear to the fella. This is 25 years ago, I suppose. Whether he ever made that leap of faith, I don't know. I know that eventually we all do. We all make that leap of faith, recognizing that alone we're powerless, recognizing that alone our lives really can become so unmanageable that there's only one solution, and that's turning to the power and the sustaining love and grace of God itself. I truly hope that he found that. And I hope that you find it as well. For me, it's a constant daily reminder. I need to be corrected every day. I think in terms of separation. And so I work diligently every day on recognizing my oneness with God, my unity with God, my absolute essential and necessary commitment in mind, body, and spirit that God is the life-giving force within me. And because of this life-giving force, there's always hope. There's always a healing. There's always a reconciliation with a brother. This is all so important in awakening to our true home in heaven. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all else will be given unto you. And there's never anybody who has strayed so far from God that one cannot come back. I'm reminded of the prodigal son story. No matter how far the prodigal son had strayed and how much he had lost in the far country, as he came home to his father, mother, God, the metaphor goes that the father was so pleased to see the son, the errant son, that a party was thrown in his honor. And that's essentially what happens with us. When we return to God, we return to heaven. And the party, if you will, is salvation and atonement. We have a feeling of bliss, a feeling of eternality, immortality, because that's our true identity. That's the truth, and the truth has set us free. Perfect love casts out all fear, and fear is based on emotion of separation. Guilt is based in this equation as well. I feel sinful and guilty. I feel separate from my Creator. But the answer is to rejoin, reassert communion with God through prayer and meditation and affirmation. Can I build a daily practice in which I remember and I'm willing to remember and I'm willing to reconcile with everybody and everything? I then see the world in a different way. I see the world filled with light rather than darkness. The darkness is lifted. God sustains my vision as Christ. I am the Christ. You are the Christ. Jesus recognized the Christ within himself, and he is a way shower. He's always allowing us, if we follow him vigilantly and diligently, to know that we too are self-actualized, that we are forever beings in the glory and in the light. You know, God has created us in its likeness and image, and we don't need to return the favor and place God in our own image. God is nothing like our ego body. The ego body is separate. It's false. Has a basis in sinfulness and guilt. But we want to let that go. All of it is built on angelic love, sacredness, wholeness, God's Christedness in us. That's our nature. God's Son is Christ, and that includes us. Jesus said we can do what he's done and more. And I think what he was saying is, have no fear. You and I are the same. I may have awakened in time more quickly than some of you. But outside of time, which is your true home, you have eternity. You are eternity. And you are as God created you. Well, I love this particular entry in the daily journal, Living in the Light. It's wonderful stuff. Let's read another one. We can talk about each of these entries. They're so wonderful. Here's one that's called Imprint. The fingerprint is one of God's smallest yet most amazing creations. Did you know that even identical twins have different sets of fingerprints? These unique signatures don't ever change, and they leave an imprint on all they touch. It could be that God gave us fingerprints to remind us how special we are. They could also be reminders of how we leave an imprint of ourselves on others. What kinds of impression are we leaving on others? When we reach out to people, what do they experience? Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves. If Christ is the definition of unconditional love, then we are the examples of Christ to others. In other words, we are to leave behind imprints of Christ wherever we go. As you go about your day, ask yourself, what kind of impression am I leaving behind? The people with whom I interact see Jesus? Remember, you have the privilege of leaving an imprint of Jesus wherever you go. And here's a concluding affirmation. Jesus, may I leave an imprint of your love every day on others. Help me to inspire people to the kind of love you show me. Amen. Well, this is a wonderful entry. Fingerprints are a good metaphor. What kind of impression, what kind of example am I setting for others? This is most important. When I leave an impression of unconditional love and forgiveness, compassion and kindness, I know that I'm doing God's work. And that is the function of Christ. That's our purpose, to be as Christ sent us here in the world, to be God's eyes and ears, hands and feet. Am I being that? Can I be that? Well, yes, of course, because the Holy Spirit from God directly into my mind and my soul works on behalf of God and works for the benefit of all humanity, all mankind. That's the truth. And that truth sets me free. Whenever I'm in alignment with the love and the graciousness and the gift of God's power, and I share that with all my brothers and sisters, and I love my neighbor as myself, I'm so uplifted that my mind is healed. And when my mind is healed, my body is healed as well. And the soul, of course, sings out in gratitude and gloriousness, because the soul is finding itself, being expressed to its fullest and as its true identity. The true self is the soul. Be that loving neighbor. Be that loving child of God that you are. Walk with your head up and your eyes wide open to the truth about who and what we are, because we are God's Son, and all our neighbors are God's children, and we are the Christ. That's the truth. And when we know this, we extend that love, and love casts out all the fear of separation that we've deluded ourselves into thinking that we're under this cloud of separation, and that we have nothing but fear and guilt in our existence. That's not true. It never has been true. It's a tiny mad idea that we want to get over. And the way to get over it, of course, is to recognize our true nature in God. God is, and God is forever. And we are forever in the light. We are illumined as the children of God. This is simple. This is wonderful. This is the truth, and it set us free. Well, that's the end of this first part of our video. We'll come back in a moment. We invite you to join us for a couple more readings and a couple more uplifting ideas about who and what we are and how dependent we are on God for our essence. So come back in a moment. Thanks for joining us. Well, welcome back to the second part of our episode today. In the second part, we're going to be reading from the Science of Mind magazine. This is the May 2021 edition, and I'm reading an entry for May 4th, 2021. And it says, in your journey through life, you eventually arrive at a fence at the end of the road. This is where your known path ends and your soul's journey begins. Just on the other side of the border, you know there's a new adventure calling. Well, it goes on, the path of greater opportunity is always available. It's never closed. The spirit within you rises to meet whatever lies before you. The curiosity to explore new territory is a divine intelligence calling to you. It already knows the whole picture and what's down the road. The stirring is spirit's movement in your consciousness to catch your attention. The source that creates and sustains all things is seeking to be wholly known in your awareness. Well, this is a lovely introduction to something we've been discussing in the first half of this episode, and that's how dependent we are on God. God allows us to get up to the gate by our own devices called the ego. But we eventually find out, usually in midlife, that we aren't entirely satisfied. Many things that we had hoped we would be gaining by a sense of fulfillment and contributing to the world, we discover we're not doing it on our own. There's got to be another way, a better way. And at that point in midlife, typically, people come around to recognizing that there is a higher power, which I call God. God is that influencer. God is that guidance, the input that we need, the light and the love that we need to make a difference in the world, to recognize that we can heal both our bodies and our minds. Other people's bodies and minds can be healed as well in our company. We can pray for people. We can pray for ourselves, but it's all done under the auspices of God. God is the strength in which I trust. God, I place the future in the hands of God. God is the vision in which I can see. God is the love in which I forgive. God is the strength in which I forgive and trust and live my life day by day. There's no other way. Once you recognize that egoic attempts on one's own are going to be fruitless eventually. We can't save the world. Whereas God, who created the universe, certainly can move through us in a beneficial way so that everybody benefits. And in a way that I don't even know, I couldn't have foreseen. It's not expected, and that's why it's called a miracle. Live your life consistent with miracles. Recognize that you're entitled to miracles. Do you know that your body is a miracle? It is a function of your mind. As the mind thinks and heals, the body then heals in alignment with the thinking of the Christ mind. So this is what we want to accomplish. This is what we want to live day by day. It gives us a purpose. It gives us the strength that we need. Very typically, I know in my own experience, if I feel tired, if I feel pain in my body, I'm not very apt to extend myself or have a good day. But when I turn everything in my mind and in my body and in the experiences of the world over to the care and the nature of God itself, which is unconditional love and grace, then I know that I'm motivated again. And I rise above, if you will, all the aches and pains and the tiredness. And I'm renewed in spirit. And as I'm renewed in spirit, I'm renewed in body. Mind, body, and spirit all go together. Well, it says, wherever you go on your new adventure, infinite intelligence awaits you because spirit is already there. It has gone before you to make the crooked ways straight. Divine guidance from within is yours now. The answer to your every question is already known. No harm can come to you on your new adventure when you know the omnipresence that walks with you. There's no tomorrow in this divine experience. Your tomorrow is merely God's today, the eternal always, which is already perfect, whole, and complete. Life begins where fear ends. Give up worry and get on with the fence, across that fence that's blocking your path, and experience more of the divine today. I love the teachings of Ernest Holmes and of the Centers for Spiritual Living Religious Science. It is so uplifting. It is so renewing of mind, body, and spirit. There can be no other way for us except through our dependence on God. That's a sacred dependence. It's not a codependency in the negative way the codependency has been talked about. Codependency is not part of the equation here. We are an expression and an extension of God. We are God in spirit. It's our nature. It's who we are. And when we're thinking rightly with Christ vision and Christ thinking, beyond the egoic self, there's no codependency there. There's simply an expression of love, perfect love. And perfect love casts out all fear. As it says here, life begins where fear ends. Give up the worry and get on over the fence that's been blocking your path. Well, I think what's been blocking our path, this metaphor of a fence, would be the fear. Uh, we don't think that we can do it on our own. We don't think we're worthy on our own. And many of us have to discover that we want to transcend all of the ideas that we are on our own. There is no individuation as such in a separation way. We're all one in unity in God. Uh, so, yes, there's an individuation, just like fingerprints. We were talking in the first half of this episode about the fingerprints all differ. There's no two snowflakes that are the same. Well, this has its value in seeing that each of us can make a contribution consistent with the talents that are given to us, with the intellectual abilities that are given to us, with the resources that we have, with the life experiences that we live. But notwithstanding that individuation, there is a collective consciousness that's greater than the sum of the parts of the parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And the whole, of course, is represented by God itself. So we want to both be the individual, spoke of the wheel, and recognize that we are part of the wheel as a spoke in the wheel. It's a good metaphor, I think. You start breaking up the spokes of the wheel, and then the whole cart falls down by the weight that can't be sustained. So what we want to do is remember who and what we are. Somebody always asks, well, who am I? What's my function in the world? Only somebody who's in the dark, an egoic thinking person would have these questions. But when we start to practice day in and day out to recognize who and what we are is Christ, Buddha, Krishna, the nature of the Shekhinah light, we are the Tao. These have all been answered for us in the ancients, in the wisdom paths, and the mystic texts, and the scriptures. It tells us we are an expression of God itself, not in form necessarily and primarily, but in spirit. Spirit transcends the five senses. Spirit transcends the three-dimensional world. We're a multi-dimensional, spiritual, vibrational, energetic expression of God. And that may be a lot for the egoic mind to absorb. So we transcend the ego and we look at ourselves through God's vision, through Christ's Buddha vision. You are as God created you. And this goes way beyond how we dress ourselves, how we educate ourselves. Those are all a tiny part of the contribution that we can make in the world. There's something far greater, and we want to open up that channel, which is our mind. The mind is everything. The mind is the builder. I love the work of Edgar Cayce, C-A-Y-C-E, Edgar Cayce. Check out some of his writings and the books on Edgar Cayce, where he talks about the power of the mind. James Allen is another person to read. Some of the early writers of the science of mind, scientific interest in the mind and the power of the mind. They all agree that thought identifies ourselves, as who and what we are. Thought comes from one of two sources: the ego, which is false and fearful, and then, of course, there's the spirit, which is truthful and loving. And we, as decision makers, with freedom of choice, can make that choice that we align our thinking, our minds, with the spirit, the love, the forgiveness and compassion, the empathy, the kindness. Live your life consistent with that, and you'll know who and what you are. Ultimately, who and what we are is one with the wheel. We are one with the sonship. There's no individuation at the level of sonship. There's simply the Christ expressing as you, as me. But, God's vision is as a wholeness. God only sees the Christ. God only knows us as the Christ and doesn't make a distinction. The sun shines equally on the just and the unjust. The rain falls equally on the just and the unjust. Why? Because we're talking about law here. Law is the perfect law of the universe, cause and effect, spiritual cause and universal effect. And we can use these. We can learn, practice, and discover through the writings of Cayce and Ernest Holmes and so many of the other pivotal, seminal writers in the field. All of this, of course, opens us up. Well, here's a affirmation: from a place of calm and clarity, my new path is made clear. You have a new path to walk. Walk it with grace. Walk it with perfect trust. And know that you are loved perfectly by God. Thank you for watching. This concludes our second half of the episode. We'll see you next time. Namaste, shalom, and peace.